The silent guest, the winter air was crisp as Sarah, Jake, Emily, and David arrived at the remote cabin deep in the snowy woods. It was New Year's Eve, and they were excited to celebrate away from the city. The cabin was old but cozy, with a stone fireplace, wooden floors, and large windows that looked out into the quiet, snow-covered forest. "This place is perfect," Emily said, dropping her bags by the door. "No neighbors, no noise, just us and a great start to the new year." Sarah, always the planner, started unpacking snacks and drinks while Jake and David brought in firewood. They had everything ready for a fun night: board games, music, and plenty of food. As the sun set, the cabin was filled with laughter, warmth, and the delicious smell of hot cocoa. After dinner, Emily suggested taking some pictures to capture the moment. They posed in front of the fireplace, holding their glasses high, smiling and laughing. Jake held up his phone and took several photos. "Let's see how they turned out," David said, leaning over to check. Jake scrolled through the pictures, and his face slowly lost its color. He swallowed hard and held out the phone to the others. Did, did any of you invite someone else?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The group huddled around the screen. In each photo, among their smiling faces, there was an extra figure. A tall, shadowy figure in the background, standing near the window. The figure's face was pale, almost blurred, with dark, hollow eyes staring directly at them. Sarah gasped. "That wasn't there when we took the picture." "Maybe it's a trick of the light," David suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Emily shivered. "It's probably just a glitch. Let's take another one." They positioned themselves again, this time making sure no one was near the window. Jake took another picture. When they looked at the screen, their hearts pounded. The figure was still there, closer this time. "This isn't funny," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling. "Who is that?" A sudden knock on the door made them all jump. They turned to stare at the entrance, their breath caught in their throats. No one moved. Knock, knock. Jake slowly walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. There was nothing outside but snow and darkness. He hesitated, then opened the door just a crack. A cold breeze rushed in, but there was no one there. David exhaled in relief. "See? Just the wind." But when they turned back inside, Emily screamed. The shadowy figure was now in the reflection of the window, standing inside the cabin. Jake spun around, but there was no one in the room. Yet, when he looked back at the reflection, the figure was still there, watching them. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. They grabbed their coats and headed for the door, but the doorknob wouldn't turn. It was stuck, as if something or someone was holding it from the other side. Then the lights flickered. The fire in the fireplace dimmed, casting eerie shadows across the room. "Okay," David said, trying to keep calm. "We just need to stay together and think." They moved toward the center of the room, standing close. The temperature dropped, and their breaths became visible. Then, the sound of soft footsteps echoed from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Sarah gripped Emily's arm. "We're not alone." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then they stopped. Silence filled the cabin. Jake, gathering courage, took a flashlight and shone it down the hallway. The beam of light revealed nothing at first, just the wooden floor and closed doors. But then, the door at the far end creaked open. A long shadow stretched across the floor. Emily whimpered. "Please tell me you see that." "I see it," Jake whispered. The shadow moved. Slowly, a figure stepped into the light. It was tall, dressed in ragged clothes. Its pale face was expressionless, its hollow eyes locked onto them. David grabbed the nearest object, a chair, and held it in front of him like a shield. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It simply stood there, unmoving. Sarah took a shaky step back. This isn't real. It can't be real. Then, the figure lifted one hand and pointed toward the group. The air grew thick, heavy. The cabin walls groaned as if they were being pressed inward. Then, the whispering started. Soft, distant voices filled the air, overlapping, whispering words they couldn't understand. The figure's mouth didn't move, but the voices grew louder, swirling around them like a storm. Emily covered her ears. Make it stop. Jake held up his phone and took another picture. Maybe if they saw it on the screen again, they could understand what was happening. He looked at the photo and his heart nearly stopped. The figure wasn't alone anymore. The background of the picture was filled with dozens of shadowy figures, all watching, all waiting. Sarah screamed, and the cabin plunged into darkness. A moment later, the lights flickered back on. The figures were gone. The room was still. The four friends stood frozen, unable to breathe. Then, the doorknob turned on its own, and the door creaked open. The cold night air rushed in. Without hesitation, they grabbed their bags and ran. They didn't look back. They drove away as fast as they could, the cabin disappearing into the night behind them. No one spoke. No one dared. It was only when they were miles away that Jake checked his phone again. His hands shook as he scrolled through the photos. The last picture was still there, but now it was empty. No shadows. No figures. Just them. But in the reflection of the window, in the far corner, was a single dark smudge. Watching. Waiting. The vanishing road the night was cold and quiet as the Johnson family got into their car. They had just spent the evening at their friend's house, celebrating New Year's Eve. The party was fun, with laughter, delicious food, and fireworks. But now it was time to go home. Mr. Johnson started the car, and Mrs. Johnson entered their home address into the GPS. Their two children, Emily and Jake, sat in the back seat, yawning after a long night. The GPS showed the usual route, but after a few minutes, it suggested a different road. This road looks new, Mrs. Johnson said, frowning. Should we follow it? Mr. Johnson shrugged. Maybe it's a shortcut. Let's try it. He turned onto the unfamiliar road. It was dark, with no streetlights. Tall trees lined both sides, their branches reaching out like long fingers. The road was smooth at first, but as they drove deeper, it became rough and bumpy. Are you sure this is the right way? Mrs. Johnson asked. The GPS says it is, Mr. Johnson replied, gripping the steering wheel. Emily looked out the window. The trees seemed to move as if they were alive. She shivered. I don't like this road. Me neither, Jake whispered. They kept driving. The road twisted and turned in strange ways. It felt like they had been driving for too long. Mrs. Johnson checked her phone, but there was no signal. This is weird, she said. We should have reached the main road by now. Then, the car's headlights flickered. The GPS screen went black for a second before turning back on. The voice on the GPS sounded different, slower, deeper. Continue straight, it said in a strange tone. A chill ran down Mr. Johnson's spine. He pressed the brakes. I don't like this. Mrs. Johnson looked at the GPS. The map showed nothing, just a blank screen except for their car's position. We should turn around. Mr. Johnson nodded and tried to turn the car, but as soon as he did, the road behind them was gone. Instead of a path, there were only thick trees. What? That's impossible, Mr. Johnson gasped. Emily screamed. Where did the road go? Jake clutched his sister's hand. I want to go home. Mrs. Johnson's hands shook. Drive forward. Maybe we'll find another way out. Mr. Johnson hesitated but pressed the gas pedal. The car moved slowly, its tires crunching on the gravel. The deeper they went, the stranger everything became. The trees no longer looked like normal trees. Their bark was too smooth, their shapes twisted unnaturally. The air felt heavy, as if something unseen was watching them. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. Its face was hidden in shadows. It didn't move. "Who is that?" Mrs. Johnson whispered. Mr. Johnson honked the horn. The figure didn't react. He turned on the high beams. The figure vanished. Emily started crying. "I want to go home. I want to go home." Mrs. Johnson hugged her. "It's okay, sweetheart." But she didn't believe her own words. The GPS spoke again. "Keep going." Mr. Johnson didn't want to listen to it anymore, but they had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. The road stretched on. The deeper they drove, the more everything felt wrong. The trees seemed to lean closer. The stars in the sky had disappeared. Even the air smelled different, like something old and forgotten. Then the car started to slow down. "I'm not doing this," Mr. Johnson said, pressing the gas pedal harder. The car stopped completely. The lights flickered off. The engine died. Silence. Then a whisper. It came from outside the car. "Leave," Jake whimpered. "Who said that?" Mrs. Johnson gripped Mr. Johnson's arm. "Try to start the car again." Mr. Johnson turned the key. Nothing. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Leave." Emily buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Mrs. Johnson tried to call for help, but her phone screen was black. Then something tapped on the window. Tap, tap, tap. Everyone froze. Slowly, Mr. Johnson turned his head toward the sound. Outside the car, a pale hand with long fingers rested against the glass. But there was no face, just darkness beyond the window. Mrs. Johnson screamed. The GPS screen flickered back on. Words appeared. "If you turn back now." "But how?" Mr. Johnson shouted. "The road is gone." Suddenly, the car roared to life on its own. The headlights beamed forward, revealing the road again. But this time, it wasn't the same. It was straight, leading to a bright light in the distance. "Go," Mrs. Johnson yelled. Mr. Johnson hit the gas pedal. The car sped forward. The trees blurred past them. The whispers faded. The tapping stopped. Faster. Faster. And then they burst out onto a familiar road. Streetlights. Buildings. Signs. It was the highway leading home. Mr. Johnson pulled over, breathing heavily. They all sat in silence, their hearts pounding. Mrs. Johnson checked her phone. Full signal. The GPS showed the correct route again, as if nothing had happened. Emily sniffled. "What was that place?" Jake wiped his eyes. "Are we safe now?" Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson exchanged a look. Neither of them had an answer. Without another word, Mr. Johnson drove home, never speaking of that road again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything was quiet, they would hear it again, tap, tap, tap. The knock at midnight. It was a cold New Year's Eve. The night was quiet except for the occasional sound of fireworks in the distance. Emma sat alone in her small apartment, wrapped in a warm blanket, sipping on a cup of tea. The glow from the fireplace flickered across the walls, creating shadows that danced in the dimly lit room. She had never liked spending New Year's Eve alone, but this year was different. Her friends had invited her to a party, but she didn't feel like going. She told them she wanted a quiet night to reflect on the past year and prepare for the new one. In truth, she just wasn't in the mood for celebrations. Something felt off, though she couldn't explain why. As the clock neared midnight, Emma looked at the time on her phone. 2 p.m. 2 more minutes until the start of a new year. She let out a sigh and leaned back against the couch. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Emma jumped, nearly spilling her tea. She turned toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who could be visiting her at this hour? She hesitated. Maybe it was a neighbor? But most of the people in her building were either out celebrating or already asleep. Another knock, louder this time, made her decision for her. She slowly stood up, placing her cup on the coffee table. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the door. She reached for the doorknob but stopped. Something didn't feel right. Why would someone be knocking at exactly midnight? Should she open it? Taking a deep breath, she slowly turned the knob and pulled the door open. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. The hallway outside was empty. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely illuminated the entrance. A cold gust of wind blew in, sending shivers down her spine. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No answer. She stepped forward, peering into the hallway. There was no sign of anyone. No footsteps. No movement. Nothing. Just as she was about to close the door, she noticed something on the ground, a small, white envelope. It looked old, its edges slightly torn. Her name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Who would leave a letter at her door in the middle of the night? She bent down and picked it up, her fingers trembling. Carefully, she tore it open and pulled out a single piece of paper. The message inside was short but chilling. "Don't open the door after midnight." Her heart raced. A cold sweat formed on her forehead. She looked around again, expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but there was no one there. She quickly shut the door, locking it. Her hands shook as she clutched the letter. Who had sent this? And why now, after she had already opened the door? A sudden noise from behind made her spin around. It sounded like whispering. Low, distant, yet unmistakable. Emma's eyes darted around the room. The whispering grew louder, like voices speaking in hushed tones. But there was no one else in the apartment. Then the lights flickered. Panic surged through her veins. She backed up against the door, gripping the handle tightly. The whispering was coming from the living room. The fireplace cast eerie shadows across the walls, making them seem like they were moving. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room. It was barely visible, blending into the darkness. Tall and unmoving, its presence sent chills through her body. Emma's breathing grew ragged. She couldn't see its face, but she felt its gaze piercing through her. The whispering stopped. The room fell into complete silence. Then, the figure took a step forward. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in place. Her mind raced. How had it gotten inside? The door had been locked. The windows were shut. There was no way in. The figure moved closer. She could make out its shape now, tall and thin, its limbs too long for a human. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying her. Then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers speaking at once, it said, "You open the door." Emma let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward. The air around her grew colder, her breath visible in front of her. She reached for her phone, but when she looked at the screen, it was filled with static. No signal. The figure took another step. Its shadow stretched across the floor, growing longer, darker. Emma did the only thing she could think of. She ran. She bolted toward her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart pounded as she fumbled to lock it. She pressed her back against the door, trying to catch her breath. The apartment was silent again. For a moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, it was gone. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate knock at her bedroom door. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up from this nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. Another knock, louder this time. She held her breath, refusing to move. Then the voice came again, right outside her door. You opened the door. Emma bit her lip to keep from screaming. Tears streamed down her face. She knew, deep inside, that she had made a terrible mistake. Then the doorknob turned. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the door slowly creaking open, and the thing standing on the other side. The haunted hotel. It was a cold winter evening when Jake and Lisa arrived at the Grand Oak Hotel. They had planned this trip for months, excited to celebrate New Year's Eve in a beautiful, historic hotel. The Grand Oak Hotel was famous for its stunning architecture, warm fireplaces, and breathtaking views of the snowy mountains. As they stepped into the lobby, Lisa gasped. It's even more beautiful than I imagined. The chandeliers sparkled above them, and the large Christmas tree in the corner was decorated with golden lights and red ribbons. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. Jake smiled. This is going to be the perfect getaway. The receptionist, an elderly woman with kind eyes, greeted them warmly. Welcome to the Grand Oak Hotel. I hope you enjoy your stay. Your room is on the 5th floor, number 512. Here is your key. Lisa took the key and thanked her. As they walked to the elevator, she noticed a painting on the wall. It showed a family dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing in front of the hotel. Their faces seemed serious, almost sad. That painting feels eerie, Lisa whispered to Jake. Jake shrugged. It's just old. Let's not scare ourselves already. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. It creaked slightly as it moved up. A soft bell rang when they reached the 5th floor. As soon as they stepped out, they felt a sudden chill in the air. Brr, it's colder here than in the lobby, Lisa said, rubbing her arms. Maybe there's a draft, Jake replied. He unlocked the door to their room and pushed it open. The room was cozy, with a large bed, a fireplace, and a window overlooking the snowy hills. Everything looked perfect. They placed their bags down and began unpacking. That night, after a delicious dinner at the hotel's restaurant, they returned to their room. Lisa changed into her pajamas and sat by the fireplace while Jake made some hot chocolate. This is perfect, Lisa sighed happily. A warm fire, hot chocolate, and the love of my life. Jake grinned and sat beside her. And tomorrow, we watch the fireworks from our window. They clinked their cups together and took a sip. The warmth spread through them, making them feel relaxed. Soon, they climbed into bed, ready for a good night's sleep. Strange noises in the night, somewhere around midnight. Lisa woke up suddenly. She heard a faint whisper. She sat up and looked around. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the fireplace. Jake was fast asleep beside her. Lisa held her breath and listened. The whisper came again, soft but clear. It sounded like a child's voice. Hello? Lisa whispered back. Silence. She shook her head. Maybe I was dreaming. But just as she lay back down, she heard a creaking sound. It was coming from the closet. Her heart began to pound. The closet door was slightly open. Had it been open before? Lisa nudged Jake. Jake, wake up. Jake groaned. What is it? I heard something. From the closet. Jake sighed and sat up. It's probably the wind. Lisa shook her head. No, it sounded like a whisper. Jake rubbed his eyes and got out of bed. He walked to the closet and pulled the door open. Nothing. Lisa exhaled in relief. Maybe I imagined it. Jake smiled sleepily. See? Nothing to worry about. Now let's get some sleep. They lay back down, and soon Jake was snoring softly. But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The mysterious shadow the next morning they decided to explore the hotel. They walked through the grand hallways, admiring the antique furniture and paintings. There were several guests, but the hotel was quiet. They stopped by the reception desk to ask about the history of the hotel. "Oh, the Grand Oak Hotel has been here for over 100 years," the receptionist said. "It has a rich history." Lisa hesitated before asking, "Has anyone ever said the hotel is haunted?" The receptionist smiled politely, but didn't answer directly. "Many guests have had interesting experiences, but the Grand Oak is a lovely place. Enjoy your stay." As they walked away, Lisa turned to Jake. She didn't say no. Jake laughed. "Lisa, you're overthinking it." That evening, they returned to their room and got ready for bed. Lisa still felt uneasy, but she told herself it was all in her head. As she drifted off to sleep, she heard a soft creak. This time, it was coming from the foot of the bed. Her eyes snapped open. In the dim light, she saw a shadowy figure standing there. Lisa gasped and reached for Jake, shaking him awake. "Jake, look." Jake sat up and looked around. "What? What is it?" Lisa pointed. But the shadow was gone. "There was someone there," she whispered, her voice shaking. Jake turned on the lamp. The room was empty. "Lisa, you're scaring yourself. Maybe it was just a dream." Lisa wasn't sure, but she didn't want to argue. Maybe. The truth about room 512. The next morning, Lisa decided to talk to one of the hotel staff. She found a young housekeeper in the hallway. "Excuse me," Lisa said. "Can I ask you something about this room?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Room 512? Lisa nodded. "Has anything strange ever happened here?" The housekeeper looked around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in. "This room has a history. Many years ago, a family stayed here. A mother, father, and their little boy. One night, there was a terrible accident. The boy fell from the window and he didn't survive." Lisa's stomach dropped. "That's awful." The housekeeper nodded. "Some say his spirit still lingers here, looking for his parents. Guests have reported whispers, shadows, and strange noises." Lisa's heart pounded. I think I heard him last night." The housekeeper gave her a sympathetic look. "Don't be afraid. He doesn't mean any harm. He's just lost." Lisa thanked her and walked back to the room, her mind racing. That night, as they lay in bed, Lisa whispered, "If you're here, we're not here to hurt you. We hope you find peace." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint whisper came, softer than before. "Thank you." Lisa squeezed Jake's hand. This time, she wasn't scared. The next morning, as they packed their bags to leave, Lisa glanced at the closet one last time. The door was open, just slightly, as if someone was saying goodbye. As they checked out, the receptionist smiled at them. "I hope you had a pleasant stay." Lisa smiled back. It was unforgettable. And with that, they stepped out into the snowy morning, leaving behind the haunted hotel, but never forgetting the little boy who still waited for his family. The masked stranger, it was a cold winter night, and the grand mansion on the hill was lit up with golden lights. The New Year's masquerade party had begun, and guests arrived in beautiful dresses and elegant suits, each wearing a unique mask. Laughter and music filled the air as people danced, chatted, and enjoyed the delicious food laid out on long tables covered in white tablecloths. Everyone was excited. The end of the year was near, and soon they would count down to midnight, welcoming a fresh start. The host, Mr. William Lancaster, was a wealthy man known for throwing the best parties in town. His mansion had huge chandeliers, high ceilings, and shiny marble floors that reflected the candlelight. Everyone who was anyone wanted an invitation to this event. Among the guests, there was a man no one recognized. He wore a long black cloak that reached the floor, and his mask was unlike any other at the party. While others wore colorful, feathered, or jeweled masks, his was plain, featureless, and completely white. It covered his entire face, leaving only small holes for his eyes. Something about him felt odd, but no one wanted to appear rude by asking who he was. The masked man did not speak. He walked silently through the crowd, observing the guests but never joining in the conversation. When people looked at him, they felt uneasy, but they brushed it off as their imagination. After all, it was a masquerade party. Everyone was dressed mysteriously. As the night went on, the guests enjoyed themselves. They danced under the glittering lights, sipped wine, and laughed at jokes. But a strange feeling lingered in the air, something unexplainable. People whispered about the silent man in the white mask. "Who is he?" they asked. "Did Mr. Lancaster invite him?" No one knew. Then, at exactly 11:45 p.m., strange things started happening. The music suddenly stopped for a moment, though the musicians swore they hadn't paused. The lights flickered as if the mansion was experiencing a power issue, but everything seemed fine. A cold breeze passed through the grand hall, even though all the doors and windows were closed. Guests began to feel nervous. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," someone said, but deep inside, they felt something was wrong. The masked man continued to move through the room, his footsteps eerily silent. When he passed by someone, they felt a chill. It was as if he carried darkness with him. Mr. Lancaster, noticing the discomfort among his guests, decided to approach the stranger. "Good evening," he said politely, forcing a smile. "I don't believe we've met. May I ask who you are?" The man in the white mask did not reply. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying Mr. Lancaster. The silence was unsettling. "I assume you are a guest," Mr. Lancaster continued, trying to stay calm. "Perhaps a friend of one of my friends?" Still, the masked man said nothing. Instead, he raised his gloved hand and pointed toward the large clock on the wall. It read 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes until midnight. Mr. Lancaster felt a shiver run down his spine. He turned to look at the other guests, who were now watching, their smiles gone. The fun and laughter of the night had disappeared, replaced by an unspoken fear. Then, the room became colder. The chandelier lights dimmed, and the flames in the candles flickered wildly, almost going out. The music, which had resumed earlier, now faded into silence once again. It was as if the mansion itself was holding its breath. The guests looked at each other, uncertain of what to do. The atmosphere had changed completely. Fear spread among them like a wave. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the clock made a loud ticking sound, louder than normal. The masked man stepped to the center of the room. He raised both hands slowly, as if making an announcement without words. Then, the clock struck midnight. The moment the final chime echoed through the hall, the lights went out completely. Gasps and whispers filled the darkness. And then, a scream. The guests panicked, their voices overlapping as they fumbled for candles or any source of light. When the lights suddenly flickered back on, the masked man was gone. But something was wrong. Mr. Lancaster, their host, had collapsed onto the floor. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide open in shock. Someone knelt beside him and checked his pulse. "He's not breathing," they cried. Chaos erupted. People ran to call for help. But strangely, the telephones didn't work. Some guests tried to open the grand doors to leave, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if they were locked inside the mansion with an unseen force. Whispers spread among the guests. "It's him," someone said. "The man in the mask. He did this, but where had he gone? And who was he?" As fear gripped the room, another guest collapsed. Then another. One by one, people began to faint. their bodies cold as ice. It was as if the life was being drained from them. Desperate, a few brave guests ran to the large windows and tried to break them, but the glass would not shatter. The mansion had become a trap. Then, a chilling laugh echoed through the hall. It was deep, eerie, and came from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. "He's still here," someone whispered. The remaining guests huddled together, their eyes darting around the room. The laughter grew louder, filling every corner of the mansion. And then a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles once again. In the darkness, shadows moved, twisting unnaturally. A voice, cold and distant, whispered, "You invited me." Someone screamed. The guests could feel something moving around them, unseen yet present. A terrible force pressed against their chests, making it hard to breathe. The air smelled of decay, as if something long dead had awakened. Then, in the faint light from the fireplace, the masked man appeared again. But this time, his mask was cracked, revealing a glimpse of what lay beneath: rotting flesh, hollow eyes, and a twisted, unnatural grin. Terror filled the room. The guests backed away, but there was nowhere to run. "Leave us alone," someone shouted. The masked figure only tilted his head once more, then took a step forward. The ground beneath them trembled. The air grew heavier. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the nightmare ended. The candles flickered back to life. The music played once more. The doors unlocked. The mansion returned to normal. But something was different. The guests who had collapsed never woke up. Their faces were frozen in expressions of horror, their bodies cold and lifeless. The survivors stood in silence, trying to understand what had happened. The masked man was gone, as if he had never been there at all. No one spoke of that night again. No one dared to. The mansion remained, but no more parties were ever held there. Mr. Lancaster's name faded into whispers, his fate unknown. And every New Year's Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, those who pass by the mansion say they hear faint laughter echoing from within, a reminder that some guests should never be invited.